Welcome to Medical Intuition Illuminated, the podcast bringing light to the wisdom of the body. I'm your host, Laura Wise, a medical intuitive and psychic medium dedicated to helping you understand the subtle and layered ways your body communicates. Here, we explore the meeting point of intuition, physiology, and energy, approaching the body not as a puzzle to fix, but as a wise, expressive system that's always speaking. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not medical advice, and it does not replace professional healthcare, diagnosis, or treatment. Always consult a qualified healthcare provider for any medical concerns. Welcome back to part 3 of my journey to medical intuition. And in this episode, I'm really going to get into how I started to develop my abilities, how I was actually forced to develop my abilities, and, how I came to really see this as my calling, and how all the threads came together in my story. So let's get into it. So when I last left off, I was headed into moving to the city, San Francisco, and I was going to start my career in user experience design. So I went to this boot camp called General Assembly, and I started the user experience design intensive course, which was a 10-week course. And in this course, it was pretty amazing in that they taught everything through design thinking. And I had never taken a course that was so experiential before. Prior to this, in college, it's a lot of lecture and, yes, there's exercises and there's a lot of, ways to express yourself, but design thinking really comes at problems differently. Instead of kind of like learning a lot of book knowledge, you're thrown right into solving problems. And, design thinking really looks at like, what is it that we are trying to solve for rather than, what is the app that we should make to make money. At least that's the heart of it. I think that tech over time has really changed, and in practice and in implementation that, in the reality is in a lot of companies, that is how it is done is, somebody has an idea for a profit opportunity, and then it's kind of reverse engineered to make it work somehow for the user. But the way that I learned in this was really, user-centric designed, user-centric experiences, in that we're, really trying to get under the hood of human psychology and what people are trying to achieve in their work, in their daily life, what problems they have that they can't solve otherwise, and then, kind of coming up with digital solutions for that. So, we would have projects where, we'd be taking a look at, let's say we wanted to put a grocery store wanted to create an online store, and they have all of these items, that normally you would shop for aisle by aisle, but that doesn't necessarily work in an online environment. And so how are you going to translate this like thousands of lists of products into categories that actually make sense for browsing in a digital environment? And at the end of this course, we also got the opportunity to work with an actual real client with a real project, where we were able to, help them kind of solve some of the problems that they were working on. So, I came out of that course and, went on the job market and was able to get quite a lot of support for kind of how to sell myself as this new role that I was having from that perspective. So I eventually got a job as a UX designer for a company called Turnitin. And if you work in the education space, it's an ed tech company, probably will have heard of it. And it's anti-plagiarism software. And, in the recent years, they've really shifted to focus specifically on AI detection tools for classrooms. But at the time that I was working on it, it was really just focused kind of more in the traditional kind of paper writing space. And I was at that job for a couple years. I had a really great team that I worked with, and I got to do a lot of research. I was really kind of like a research designer hybrid role. And it was a really great start to be in the field. But after a couple years, I decided that I wanted to move back to Santa Rosa. We had been living in the Oakland area, me and my now husband, right near Lake Merritt. And it was, a very fun experience, in that there's like incredible restaurants, so much culture. Oakland is, the people in Oakland are really the heart of it for me. And I just felt like, it's a very urban environment, but there's so much diversity of people and thought, and there's so much artistry and creativity there, that was really incredible to experience. But I am a country girl at heart, and that I just love nature and I want to be out. I'd rather be in a field than in a city, any day. And so I was really just aching to move back to a little bit quieter of a place. And so we decided we were going to move back to Santa Rosa. And additionally, it was significantly less expensive at the time for us to live up here. So I was looking for a job that would allow me a little more flexibility with that. I ended up working for a company called Answer Lab, which is a UX research agency, and was able to do that remote. And so for this job, I was working with some really high level clients on a regular basis. And it was contract work for an agency, right? So it's constantly changing. And I had to become often an expert in these different tech tools pretty quickly. I'd have maybe 1 to 2 meetings to get up to speed on whatever it was that we were going to be testing. And then I'd have to kind of write a research plan and then go and do the sessions. And so the main client I worked for the first couple years was Instagram. And so I was working with a couple of different teams. I was working with a team that was doing a lot of the video call product that they had, which they called real-time communication, and then also some other features associated with that as well. And then I was also working with the small and medium business team. The SMB team. And so I got to, a lot of the times I was doing something called rolling research, where we would have just regular research on a monthly cadence. And then, people would submit their features that they needed to be tested. And I would be testing, 5 or 6 different things within one session. And we were really focusing on a younger demographic. So it was between people between the ages of 14 and 21 for that team. And so I got to talk to a lot of Gen Z teens in that period of time, which was fascinating, but a little bit challenging to talk to these folks about social media use at the time. And so it was pretty grueling in that I would, when I was doing these sessions, I would, go down to the city, I would go to the office for Instagram, and I'd pick up the phone that we would be testing, like the device that we would be testing that had the prototypes preloaded onto it. And then I would have a meeting to kind of go over those prototypes and get up to speed so that the next day when I flew out, so I would fly out the next day to various locations, and we did all over the country. We kind of went to a different city every month. So I'd be set up in this market research office in a building, usually in downtown in one of these big cities. And I would have 6-hour-long sessions back to back, basically all day. And it would just be me. And then there would be a tech guy who would be setting up kind of the live stream for the stakeholders to watch. And I would, and also kind of do the recordings as well so that we could review them later. And these sessions are intense, they're 1 hour long, but I am multitasking to the max in the middle of them. So not only am I, running through the prototypes and the script that we have, but I'm also, have a chat message going with the various stakeholders who are asking me questions or guiding me. Hey, I want to know more information about this thing, or can you follow up on that question? And then I'm also taking detailed detailed notes of everything that I see, because I'd have to write a report, pretty quickly afterwards. I'd have maybe 1 to 2 days turnaround time to kind of synthesize all of the things that I heard throughout all of the sessions. And then meanwhile, I'm also trying to create rapport with this participant where I seem natural and interested and curious, and I'm remembering the things that they say and reacting to them, properly, and just doing that over and over again all day with maybe I think I'd like a half an hour, 45-minute break in between for lunch. And then that was it. And then I'd, go to sleep and then fly home the next day. And then the next day, I'd have to write the report. So it was, very intense work and, very interesting, very exciting to kind of be on the cutting edge of a lot of these new things that were coming out and really getting to see what was being developed. And of course, most of them I can't talk about because I signed tons of NDAs, but really, really interesting. And then I also really loved, seeing the small and medium businesses and how they were using these tools and social media as well. That was fascinating. And then I worked on Instagram for quite a while, did some work for Facebook. I also decided to express interest in Oculus, which is the VR system that Meta was using. So I got to work on several Oculus projects where we were testing some of the interfaces kind of within the VR system. And that was just fascinating. I did, at that point, we had already shut down for COVID. So I was doing all of those sessions remote at that time. And we'd have to anyways with, seeing people's VR setups. So sometimes with those sessions, like they wouldn't even see my face at all. They would just hear my voice because they would already be kind of set up in their VR system. And then I would drop into the, video call and just interview them. And so, because I have these extra sensory abilities that I didn't fully realize that that's what was happening, but it made me an excellent researcher because I could kind of really feel what people were experiencing, right? And you never want to, as a researcher, you never want to, you don't want to prime people. You don't want them to assume what they're saying. I always wanted to kind of guide them into saying what it was that they were expressing, even if I, kind of already had gotten there mentally. I needed them to literally spell it out so that I could capture that as a quote or make sure that I'm not influencing their experience of it as much as possible. But really, my abilities really helped me to kind of sense what was going on in that. And it also helped me with my clients and my stakeholders in that I could really quickly pick up what they were trying to imply from different features or different things as well. And generally, I tried to have really good boundaries, but I didn't know that much about having energetic boundaries around receiving that type of information. So there would be times when I would be in sessions and I would hear, spirits come through, or I would hear, somebody's guides talking about them, or I would hear stuff about somebody's body, and I would just be like, nope, can't do it. Not now. I've got, stakeholders on the line. This is not appropriate. This is not something that I can tune into right now. And then they would go away. So I was at that job for, a good 3 years, and it was a very stressful job. Not only was it the work really intense, the expectations were extremely high, but I was also traveling a lot. I'd be traveling, 1 to 2 weeks out of the year, and I would also, out of the month. And sometimes I would also be going down to San Francisco to be working out of the office there to do sessions. And, when that was happening, it would be kind of really full on, like all day, that I would be just really intensively on. So pretty soon after I had started this job, I learned that I was pregnant with my daughter, my first child. And, right before that, I had a miscarriage, and it was really devastating to me at the time. I just, it was really unexpected, and I had no coping mechanisms for that. It was not, something that I really anticipated. I didn't really know how to talk about it. And I don't think that our, culture really knows how to handle that properly, and people don't really know what to say. And I just felt really isolated at the time. But I did end up getting pregnant again within a few months. And, it definitely was a stressful pregnancy because I was just so anxious about everything about it, and had that loss. And so was just really, really nervous about the whole pregnancy. And on top of that, I was traveling a great deal, so my daughter's already been to like a lot of cities that, when she was in my belly while I was traveling. I was doing this really intensive job, and I was set to work really right up until I was supposed to give birth. I think I had scheduled like a couple weeks before my due date or something that I was going to be able to rock. So I was really excited for that. And I was going to kind of do a few things to prepare for it. But again, I was just under so much stress at the time. And I had planned a home birth, and I was really excited. I was really passionate about the home birth. I had, read all the books. I had seen the documentaries, and I was very adamant that this was the experience that I wanted. But unfortunately, because of all the stress that I was under, but who knows, I ended up going into labor 5 weeks early. I had actually gone to see my midwife that day on, the day before. And she was like measuring me, and midwives are so wise. And she's like, you're measuring full term. Like, you need to be prepared for this baby to come early. And I was like, oh, okay, we'll see. And then I booked in with my OB, and I was like, I just want to get things checked out. And they were like, you're fine. Like, they just kind of brushed me off with that. And I was like, okay, whatever. And so I went home that night and went to bed, and I woke up in the middle of the night to my water breaking. And I was like, oh, no, 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 no. It's too early. It's too early. And, called my midwife, and she was like, okay, we'll just like, see how things progress, but you're probably going to have to go in because I'm in California, and you have to be, I think it has to be within 4 weeks of your due date to be able to have a home birth, or it's not legal, because they want to be able to monitor things. So, I was like already coming to terms with the fact that I wasn't going to have, the experience that I wanted, and that things were potentially going to go a very different way. And I had really been mentally preparing for like, if I go into the hospital, like, they're going to try to do a lot of interventions, and I really don't want that. So we kind of waited for contractions to really start, and they kind of didn't. And so I was eventually like, all right, I got to go in and get admitted. I went in, and I had, my friend also came in who was a doula, my doula for me. And so we went in, they admit me, and they were really starting to push, for induction. And I was like, no, let's just wait and see what happens. And, I really want to try to get this labor going. And, my doula friend was like, let's do it. And she did all the things that, like she had me walking up and downstairs, and she had me just really trying to get this baby going. And then at some point she switched out with my midwife, in the middle of the night. They were kind of tag teaming with that. And this birth just took so long. I think, things kept picking up. It's really, birth is so trippy, and that, you're just like, I really had no sense of time. It's really painful, but I, was having contractions, and they, again, were really trying to push induction. And I was like, I'm not doing that. And the doctor came in and was just really, really mean to me. And I was like really pushing for it and trying to share all these scary statistics. And I looked her in the eyes, and I was like, look, I'm a researcher. Like, I understand how statistics work, and this is what I'm doing. So if it's not medically necessary right now, I'm not doing an induction. And I really stood my ground with that, because I just had that feeling like if they induced me, it was going to go all the way to a C-section. And I really did not want to have that. And I was really going to try to stick to an unmedicated birth plan, because that's what I wanted to do personally. And And so, the night is moving on. I'm just like really having this kind of psychedelic experience. I'm feeling all these energies. We're in a hospital, which is just like such a portal between life and death, honestly. And um I found out after the fact that the room they put me into labor, they were like, you get the big room. Oh, that's so great. But it was actually a converted surgery room. Um, so I think I was really picking up on some energy in that room, and in the middle of this deep, deep in labor, I heard this voice say, your baby's gonna die. And it had that ring of truth to it in the fact, and in a way that's true. And like, we are all going to die someday. Right. So it like, that is a true statement, and it didn't say it's going to die right now, but to a fearful, mother in the state of, this experience, that was very potent and really threw me off. There was also a nurse that kept coming in, and his energy was just like deeply creepy. And I just, did not feel comfortable with this person, but I just couldn't say anything to it. So I'm just like picking up on these vibes. Things are getting really weird. And eventually, I really do end up making it through this. It was, I don't even know how many hours of labor, and then another like 3 hours of pushing, and just kind of roared this baby out of me. And she came out and she was so tired. She was just clearly had been through it. I couldn't get her to latch. She was definitely, a little bit jaundiced. And, they gave me some time with her, but we were in the room for just a few hours. And they were like, her blood sugar is really not good. Her blood sugar is not rising fast enough. And we're going to need to take her to the NICU. And so I remember they just like rolled her down to the NICU, and it wasn't even like the full NICU. It was like the intermediate nursery, they call it, but it's kind of like in between regular and NICU. But they had to, hook her up to an IV, and her poor little tiny hand was in this IV, and, she was separated from me, and I was trying to rest, but, my baby wasn't near me, and I was just like, had all these hormones running through me. I could feel everything, and I was just like sobbing, and just this like, again, that feeling of being so close to the veil of life and death, and just feeling, I think I could also like feel people's pain in the hospital, and just the sensitivity was just off the charts, and my anxiety was off the chart, and it was just this really harrowing experience. And so, she would wake up and they would call me and say, you got to come down and, try to hold her and breastfeed. So I would, pull myself out of the bed and, hobble down the hall, bleeding, and exhausted, and, try to hold this baby, and she would not latch. And so I'd have to pump and try to feed her that way. And just... I remember at one point holding her and just looking her in the eyes and, saying, you're going to do this. Like, you're going to get strong, and you're going to get your blood sugar up, and we're going to get out of here, and we're going to go home. And I swear she looked right back at me. She was like, yeah, we are. And they were like, she's going to be in here a long time. And I was like, she's not. She pulled it up, and she was only really in there for about a day. And we were able to get her back into the room and again, try to work on breastfeeding. And they were able to be discharged to go home, which was such a relief after that ordeal. So I think we had been admitted on Tuesday afternoon, and then I didn't go home to my house until I think Saturday morning. It was either Friday night or Saturday morning. So it was several days that we were in there, and it was just, my nervous system was just shot. And now I'm home and I have to figure out, how to be a mom, and the sleep deprivation and feeding, and we're still not breastfeeding. And it was just this really heartbreaking experience. And so, we ended up having to actually go back for a well check, in a couple days, and she was still really jaundiced, and they were worried about bilirubin. And so they actually wanted to readmit us and to put her under the light therapy that they do for that. And so, I just remember the feeling of walking back into that hospital to be readmitted was just so overwhelming and devastating. Just because it was like getting re-traumatized all over again. And, but she did great. I didn't necessarily do great. I had a really hard time with it. And, but we were only in there for another day, and then she was able to get better and come home. But it was a really tough transition into motherhood, and she was a tough baby. She was early, and I think, it caused her a lot of digestive issues. And I do really feel like the experience that we had together in the hospital has given her a lot of anxiety at a base level that we have been working on supporting her with. And I just, I think that there's a lot of policies in place in hospitals that are for covering their asses, but aren't necessarily for what's best for everybody involved. And I think we were definitely experienced that. So anyways, I'm getting used to parenthood. I'm trying to, get used to being a mom and having a parent, but my nerves are shot, and I'm just on, and I honestly just feel haunted from this experience. And I just really couldn't come down for that, and my sensitivities were just blown through. And so I start looking for answers, and I don't even know where to look to get support for. I don't even know what kind of support I need. I don't even know what I need. I just start, looking, and I was listening to a lot of podcasts back then. And so I was really into a lot of paranormal podcasts. And one of them that I loved was called Astonishing Legends. And they do these very nerdy deep dives into every possible paranormal topic you've ever heard. And on one of the episodes, they invited on this medium called Jim Hunt, and he did a live session for one of the hosts of the show. And I heard him, and I was like, this is great. This is so incredible. I want to get a session from this man. And so I actually did. I went and I booked it, and I had a beautiful session with him. And just, it was the first time I'd ever really had a mediumship session. And I was just blown away by kind of what he was able to pull through and kind of the connections he was able to make. And it was just a really great experience. But I also remember this feeling of envy that I had for him as well. I'm like, this is a job? You can do this? I want to do that. But I was like, no way, there's no way. Cause he, he had been one of these born mediums where he, from a child, he had been seeing and experiencing spirit. And I was like, yeah, I have weird stuff that happens to me, but that's not really kind of my level at that point. And around this time, I also had started learning about this modality called the emotion code. And I read the book by the person who kind of came up with this modality. And it's centered around being able to release what they call trapped emotions from the body. By locating them. There's a chart that they have that lists all the different emotions, and then you kind of work through the chart to pinpoint which emotion it is and what age it's from, and then release those. And I found this completely fascinating, and I started to do the techniques on myself, and I was just kind of blown away by what surfaced as I was kind of releasing these different emotions and the things that were shifting in me as I released these emotions. And I remember there was one day that I was working on myself, and I came across a particular emotion that I was strangely attached to it. I was like, oh, I have to feel this feeling of guilt or shame or whatever it is because, I deserve that. And if I don't I'm using this as a tool to remember, like, to behave better. And I literally felt this like angelic presence show up, and we had a conversation about this emotion. And this presence was just going on and talking about, like, you've got to release it. You have to release it because it allows so many more things to happen in your life. And whatever shame or guilt you feel about this situation, the good that you're going to do in return is going to be so many times full, so many times that it really, you have to release it. And I did release it, and, had this experience of just, peacefulness from doing that. And I really loved the modality at the time, and I decided that I wanted to be a practitioner. So I went ahead and took their practitioner course. And that was really valuable at the time. And I learned a lot of things from that. It's not a modality that I use a ton anymore, because mostly because I feel like the techniques that I use now are a little bit more effective, and that you can, instead of working with individual emotions, you can work with, the situation and experience as a whole, and release kind of things around that. So I just find that to be more effective. But I do often use the emotion code with children in particular, because, it's a little more straightforward, and it makes a little more sense for kind of the experiences that they've had. And so around this time, I also discovered, one of my mentors, Danielle Sarank, who's also known as the Squamish Medium. And I, was still, again, looking for more podcasts, because I just feel like I kept being like, there's more that I need to know. And so I found her podcast, which is all about her mediumship journey, and just, philosophy around mediumship and spiritual philosophy. And I listened to the first episode. It wasn't her first episode, but it was the first one that I listened to. And literally the moment I heard her voice, I was just like, yes, this person is my teacher. Like, it was like a full body experience. I just knew. And, she's just somebody who's incredibly grounded in her practice. It's very real. There's not a lot of fluff. It's definitely like, very spiritually inclined, but it was just so practical and so grounded. And she's also, a mom, and she also had come from, some more, traditional fields or male dominated fields. Like, I was in tech. And so it just was such a good fit for me. And, she kept talking about her course that she has, her core course, which is called the Initiation, which is, for developing mediumship. And every time she would talk about it, I would just get this feeling like, I'm supposed to take that, and that kind of envy feeling would come up again of like, oh, I need to be doing that, And, all the while I'm still working in tech. I am at Answer Lab, although that is becoming, a really, really hard job to do as a parent. I just didn't have the flexibility that I used to have. I couldn't, just be available for clients whenever I needed to. And just the pace was wearing me out. So I ended up actually applying to another job, and got an offer at a company called Weed Maps, and they are focused on creating a listing, basically like a Google search for dispensaries, for cannabis dispensaries all over the country. And at the time, I was also having quite a lot of a dark night of the soul about working for all these social media companies. I was just, feeling like I don't necessarily want to be contributing to what impact this is having on the world. And, was just feeling really a lot of weight around that. And so decided that I was gonna, I was like, well, the cannabis industry's got to be like less, intense than that. And so I kind of switched. And, I also was able, one of the main reasons I took that job is because I had the person who would have, who was my boss, was this incredible woman who just, had just very human centered, very thoughtful and considerate, very, and definitely had some woo influences. She would talk about, the energy of things in meetings and use words like zen. And, you'd go into her office and she would like spray lavender on everyone. It was just such a beautiful, nurturing experience to come into. And so that felt like a really good fit. So I switched jobs. And shortly after that, I discovered that I was pregnant with my son as well. And so I had really, my daughter's birth and early, couple years were just really, really challenging. And I was kind of like, maybe we just have one kid. But I just kept feeling this little boy spirit hanging out, wanting to come through, and he was very insistent. And I had an additional session with Jim Hunt, at some point, and he's like, about the like little boy spirit, right? He like completely called it out. I had another person as well call it out energetically, and so I just knew he was there, and I was like, talked to my husband, and I was like, we have to have him, right? And so, I got pregnant with him and I was going through, pregnancy with him. And I remember we got back because I was over a certain age, geriatric pregnancy, you can get the like test results early for the sex. And so I remember getting that email or paperwork or whatever back and validating that it was a boy. I was just, they're like, it was a boy. And I was like, I knew it. I knew it was a boy. I was just like so validated in that moment. And so that spring, I also decided to officially sign up for the initiation with Danielle Sarank and to actually do that program. And kind of go full in on these abilities because I just, I was at a point in my life, I just like knew I couldn't turn them off. I really felt like I needed to develop or I was going to go, I don't want to say insane because that's a little dramatic, but I was just not functioning as well because I didn't have the boundary tools that I needed to. And this is something else that with the emotion code that I find challenging is that you're doing essentially energy work but they don't really provide a framework around energetic boundaries or energetic hygiene or kind of, anything along those lines. And so I think it can often leave people really vulnerable to that stuff if you don't have really the tools for it. So I was pregnant with my son and I do the initiation course and it was so beautiful. Such an incredibly well thought out course. Just her attention to detail and space creation is phenomenal. And, one of the most incredible things she does is that she throws you in immediately into session practice. Like the first week you're like sitting in front of somebody else doing a reading. Because her feeling is just, you like experiential is the way you develop. You can theorize and philosophize all you want, but until you get in front of somebody and start reading them, that just, you're not really in it yet. And so, the first couple sessions, maybe, I would definitely get information, but it wasn't a lot at first. And it, it'd be like maybe one or two pieces and, we both would be like, yay, that's great. Whoever I was practicing with. But pretty quickly I started to get a lot of information and it just became clear that this was, wouldn't say easy, but I would say natural. It was very natural for me to kind of connect in these spaces, and the better that I got with my energetic boundaries and the better that I got with, applying the different techniques and tools that she taught us, in it. I just started to have these like incredible readings. And the other beautiful thing about this is that I'm getting readings every week also through this whole process. And so I'm getting, a lot of information about this being my path. I had several people in this experience were like, yeah, you're going to do this. Like, I see it as clear as I can in this experience. And at that time I was like, no, I don't think so. I don't know. I still really had a lot of self-doubt about it. But the beautiful thing about being pregnant during this time is that, my son, I could connect with him in such a deep way while he was in my belly. And he even would say like, oh, you got a session like coming up, like, let me help you. Let me help you bring through information. I'm here. And I was like, really? And he'd be like, yeah, which was so sweet. And so, I got to go through that whole course like with him. And then following that, I was really preparing for his birth. And, that was such a hard pregnancy for me in that it was just physically demanding. He's a very athletic child, and he was just like athletic in my belly too. He's always like spread out and pressed against it. My hips were in like quite a lot of pain. I could barely move towards the end of it. Like walking was incredibly painful. My like hips would grind together. And I was really done. And I had been so sure he was going to come early, like my daughter did. I was like, yeah, he'll come. I just, and even he's born in August. And even now I'm like, sometimes when I'm writing his birthday down, I almost put July because I was like so sure he was going to be a July baby. But no, he waited. He was actually 5 days late after his due date. So I was like completely miserable. I was like, I'm never having this baby. Like, he's never coming out. I was like so depressed and just in so much pain, like constantly. But I was very determined not to have the same experience with my daughter. And so I didn't even try for a home birth this time because it would like expense wise, it was just not on the cards. It's because you have to pay completely out of pocket for that. But I was like, I don't want to be in the hospital for days and days. I can't do it. And so I really waited until I was like significantly in labor to go in. I eventually was like telling my husband, I was like, cause I had to feel false start. So actually I told him, I was like, actually, I've been in labor for a few hours. He's like, what? What do you mean you've been in labor since 3:00 and it's like 8:00 now? So we ended up going to the hospital. I think we got there and got checked in around 11:30 or 12, and he was born within an hour. Like, we didn't even get out of the triage room. They could tell I was progressing so quickly that like they're like, we're just having the baby here. And like they didn't even have a room set up for me. And I had this nurse that was like the triage nurse, and he was incredible. He had been like a nurse and veteran, like he was a veteran, and he had been in like wartime hospitals and things. And so he just had like calm presence, and he was the best. And it's funny, the midwife on duty was very young. Like, she was like very clearly like freshly minted midwife, and he was very much running the show, and she would just come in and be like, yep, that looks good. And so he came out just like so quickly, just fully healthy. And I think we weren't even in the hospital like a full 24 hours. Like, they discharged us the next day by like 3 p.m. Because they were like, if he passes all his tests, do you want to go home? And I was like, yes, I want to go home. I don't want to be here anymore than I have to. And so bring him home and, just get used to being a family together. And so it took me a few months to kind of come back to my mediumship, because I had to get, really in a place where I had headspace and time and everything. So it was good like 6 months to 9 months before I was really ready to pick that up again. And I decided it was finally time to join the membership for my mentor, Danielle Sarank. She has an incredible membership that is just, a very safe, soft place to land. And so I was able to, again, kind of really dive in. And again, there's a lot of practice pairing opportunity. So I was able to, again, continue to develop, continue to practice, continue to play. As I was trying out different modalities, I could kind of bring those in and be like, I'm going to try some animal communication today. And the person would be like, great, I have a dog. And, and I'm getting lots of readings. And so really just able to kind of play in that space and see what stuck and what made sense. So one thing that I did that was, I think, really key to my development through this period of time is that even really early on, before I even learned about Danielle Sarank and started the initiation and that whole process of development of mediumship, I started to, sit every day. I started to meditate every day. And, it was really a place where I was able to kind of spend time with myself and create space around the things that were happening to me and allow, myself to really distinguish between my energy and the energies that were around me and coming in. And it started off with, just maybe 5 to 15 minutes a day. Sometimes I would do upwards of, 30. And especially when I was doing like really significant development, it was so key for me to be able to have that opportunity every day to kind of take space. And, I was a mom of two, so I was almost every day. It wasn't always there, but, my husband was really able to support me in that he would make a lot of space for me to do that. He would actually he'd see me get a little off or, overwhelmed. And he'd be like, have you sat recently? Have you sat? And he still will do that. I don't sit as much, it's on a daily basis anymore, but still if I have a really hard week, he'd be like, when was the last time you sat? And so I was typically often doing the meditation that I had learned from Vipassana just as a starting place. And then I would quite often have kind of like a backlog of messages and information from my guides or other energies or spirits sometimes that were coming in. And, I had throughout the day, I'd be like, I don't have time to listen to this right now. And so I would ask them to come back later, and they would, and they would come, they know that my time that I would be sitting. And once I sat, I, had that time with them to speak and hear their messages. I would also sometimes do an exercise called sitting in the power, which is a mediumship exercise where you're kind of learning how to expand your energetic field kind of out and out and out to be able to kind of feel into energies more easily and then kind of bring that energy back into your body. And again, this was just all of this was really key for me to be able to understand what my baseline energy naturally felt like, so that I could recognize it. And then I could recognize it when there was an energy that was not mine that was coming in, and the difference between that. And so I do definitely recommend to anybody that is in a development period to really, spend time quietly with yourself on a regular basis. And, at first when I first started doing it, it was really interesting. And almost every time, there would be messages coming through or angels showing up. I went through a period of time where these angels, one by one could come and introduce themselves to me. And I had gotten Kyle Gray's book, I think it's called Angel Prayers. It's his kind of, reference. It's almost like a reference book of all the different angels. And, I was able to feel these kind of angel presences come in. They would tell me what they were about, what they, felt and looked like, and what they were concerned with. And then I would go and look them up and learn their name and learn all about them. And it would match, with what I had experienced. And so, it was really exciting at first to have all these energies coming through, but there was a point when, it's not happening every time, right? And it's not necessarily shiny and new, and you still want to have that quiet place to just sit and be with your energy and sort out my thoughts and really get grounded. And that's been such a great resource for me. And around this time, I started to hear about, the field of medical intuition. And I was like, that is so cool. It was just really appealed to me. But I was like, well, I don't know if this is, really for me. I'm curious about it. So I'll just start reading these books. I found these books by this woman named Tina Zion. And she has a series of books on kind of training as a medical intuitive. And I was like, well, I'll just, read these books and try some things out. And very quickly I started to get that envy feeling again, where I was like, oh, I really want to do this. But I don't think that I could, right? And I continue to develop. And because I have this incredible space to practice in, I'm able to really start doing, practice medical intuitions. And very quickly it became clear that I was very accurate, and all of that Ayurvedic training, all that traditional Chinese medicine and my psychology education really just came back full force. And I was immediately able to see the body through that lens and immediately got a lot of feedback that, what I was seeing and hearing was resonating with people. And so in her books, Tina Zion has, pretty early on in the books, there is a meditation practice where it's, called like Meet Your Medical Intuitive Guide, singular, theoretically. And so I do this meditation and I get comfortable and I kind of go down and then I call in this medical intuitive guide. And then I look around and there are literally thousands of guides surrounding me. And again, I do the thing where like, nope, that can't be right. Like, no way. There's no way that there's supposed to be one person that's showing up for me. And I like get out of the meditation and I'm like, I'm going to try this again. And I like get into the meditation and start again and go back down. And they're all still there. And I'm like, okay, okay. That's interesting. And so, I really was like, okay, this is the thing. Like the universe is telling me this is my path. And I had already been thinking about, going into mediumship, and I had been starting to do professional work in that realm and, doing, some paid sessions and really building out that. And then, but once I added in medical intuition, I just knew, I was like, this is it. And, pretty quickly was able to add that into my offerings as well. And so that was it. I was just like, this is my path. And it started to be really clear that, tech was not a good space for me. It's incredibly male dominated, field. It's really masculine energy. It's incredible hustle culture. You're basically expected to kind of give your blood, sweat, and tears constantly, in exchange for, a high salary and these like supposedly good benefits. But, tech has changed over the last, decade that I was in it. And more and more of those benefits started to be stripping away, more and more the pressures that came on. It wasn't the kind of fun design thinking, playful experience that I had. And eventually the wonderful manager that I had, I one day just got a complete download from the universe telling me she's needed elsewhere. There's another opportunity that's going to be really good for her that she needs, because she was always really having to push against the other leaders in the organization and try to get them to really think with design thinking. And it was a struggle for her. And so I knew that, I just felt it. I was like, she's going to leave, and that's going to be the best thing for everybody involved. And I actually ended up having a meeting where I was like, because I had already told her, who I was and my abilities. And we'd had some very, honest conversations about that and about spirituality and, all of those things. And I ended up telling her, I know that you're meant to be somewhere else. And, that's what's good for you, and you should do it. And, the team is going to be all right without you, and that's what you need. And she was like a little taken aback, I think, but, within a few weeks she moved on. And when she moved on, the company climate changed and was no longer tenable for me. And really that kind of spit me out, and it was time for me to go full time on my dreams. And that's when I fully commit into, my path and devoted to it. And so it's really interesting in that I know that a lot of people say things like, in the spiritual community, they say things like, oh, there's always a right time, or like, even if you don't get it this time, next time there's no rush on your path and your calling. It's going to come back around. And especially within the last few years, that is not the message that I got. Instead, my guides have really been insisting that I teach, and that teaching is super important for this path and bringing this information to people. And so, I've gotten a few guides that really come in and say, we need as many people as possible informed about these types of topics and have this awareness around spirituality and around their body. And, we need you to be out there kind of sharing information as much as you possibly can. And time is of the essence, because we are at a great kind of crossroads for humanity. And the more people that we can have, educated in these areas, the better. And the better for this whole transition period. And so I have really been, kind of trying to take that to heart and, take up the call to do that. And so I do have some, teaching programs or courses coming out soon. I'm going to be adding some more kind of one-off courses as well. And that's also a little bit of impetus behind this podcast as well, to be another avenue to really be educating and sharing what I've been through and what I've experienced and what I see and what I hear from my guides. So that all brings us up to just about now. And, this journey is not over. I will continually be evolving and learning new things and, embracing new versions of myself as I grow. And I will be sharing that here as they are significant or as I understand them. But thank you for joining me on this journey up to now. And I hope you have a beautiful day. We'll talk to you on the next episode. Thanks for listening to Medical Intuition Illuminated. If this episode resonated, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who might benefit. Special thanks to Derek Ryan for music. Until next time, listen deeply to the wisdom of your body.